recording, but we are with Doug
Welcome.
Campbell. Doug Campbell is an economist. He is currently at the New Economics School in Moscow, Russia, an excellent institution. He has a PhD in economics from UC Davis in California. And he has a background actually that's pretty diverse. It encompasses both policy and academia. Doug served on Obama's Economic Council of Economic Advisors, the CEA. And he currently is a researcher. He has work that's been published in the Journal of Public Economics, in World Economy, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you have an R&R at the Review of Economics and Statistics.
So I have a conditional acceptance at the Review of Economic Studies.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
That's even better. That's even better than Restat.
Yeah.
That's top 5.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Well, they're both good journals, but yeah.
Yeah, they're both excellent journals. I know. All right. So, first of all, I suppose I'd like to just frame this as sort of an interview that's geared more towards people who don't necessarily have a background in economics. And
Sure.
so along those lines, I'd just like to ask you, and your background really interests me. What was your role in the Obama administration? What did you do as a staff economist at the White House? And has that had an influence on your subsequent research agenda?
Yeah. So how I got to DC, I was always interested in coming into politics, and in fact, my interest in economics actually started when I was very interested in politics and economic policy, basically. And so I think when I was an undergrad and I was kind of thinking about what to do, I was also interested in political science, maybe. I was interested in maybe becoming the Foreign Service. And there was some quote by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which he was saying something along the lines, if you're liberal, there's a few things you should do when you're young and you're ambitious. One thing, you should go and work in DC. You should see how the city operates. Another thing is you should go get a degree in something like economics so you can prove to the more conservative half of the world that you're actually a serious person. And so basically I looked at that and I thought that was interesting. I actually did not like my undergraduate classes at Boston College in economics much at all. I thought that there was some kind of almost like an intelligence gap between. I shouldn't say that. I'm not gonna say something that gets me in trouble. So there were smart professors in economics at Boston College, but relative to the classes that I liked the most were in, say, American Foreign Policy with Donald Hafner, which was just an amazing class of kind of about the recent history of American foreign policy. And in other subjects, history were classes that really interested me a lot. My economics classes, some of them, it was kind of a mixed bag. Some of them were good, some of them were better than others. But I thought that actually, if you look at the main policy topics in the world, it's actually that governments decide, main policies that really determine whether a society kind of sinks or swims. It's all about economic policy, kind of the most important. And so I chose to do economics kind of as a career. After I was a second-year PhD student at UC Davis, or actually, I think it was it was second year when the crisis hit. And so I started applying for jobs in DC, internships or whatever. Finally, I got an internship at the Democratic National Committee in the targeting department. And so the targeting department, they choose who to target for, get out the vote during an election. And so I was kind of there at an interesting time because they had kind of just discovered big data, and they discovered the power of doing randomized experiments. And so when I was there, the DNC actually had no institutional knowledge of previous experiments, like nothing.
Wow, that's crazy.
Wow. And so I was there when we actually first started saying, let's try to do an experiment. You've got a group of 20,000 voters. We're going to send out a mailer. Let's send it out to just 10,000 of them, and then the other 10,000 let's keep back as a control group, and then let's see what the impact is of these things. And so that's essentially what I was doing the first time around. The second time around, so I was there for like 3 months, and then was coming the 2010 election, and so I went back to DC. And that time I was actually in charge. I was kind of put in charge of figuring out which voters to contact for the midterm elections. So there's the kind of a bittersweet thing to have in your resume is that I was kind of one of the guys kind of leading the targeting effort for the Democratic National Party in 2010 when the DNC lost, the Dems lost 63 seats in the House.
Wow.
And so that was my experience. And so like my last day was basically the day that we lost 63 seats in the House, and I flew back to California to continue working on my PhD the next day. And so that was a very bitter experience, but it was also very interesting. And so at the DNC, there was a bunch of 30-year-olds making policy, and so I actually really enjoyed it. We got to do cool things. If I wanted to do an experiment or something, I could just do it. I just asked my boss, and they'd be like, yes. And so then, cool. So now I get back to. So I'd also been applying for internships at the Council of Economic Advisors, and so finally, at first, I got, after maybe the fifth or sixth time applying, they finally got me on as just an unpaid intern. And so the other interns were like undergraduates. I was in there as like a third-year PhD student. The other PhD students were staff economists, and so they're paid. The pay wasn't great, but you get a real salary. After I was there, one of the staff economists who was visiting from Harvard actually quit part of the way in, and a position opened up. And so once it opened up, I was like, I was going to get it. And so I did. And, the work as a staff economist was interesting. I don't know that many people who go and do it really enjoy the experience on a day in, day out basis. But like looking back, I thought I got to do interesting things. The big thing I got out of it, well, so I was actually somewhat fortunate. So I was there at the same time as Jay Shambaugh and Chad Bown. And Chad kind of took me under his wing a little bit and actually showed me some things that were helpful for my research career. So I'm very grateful to both him and Jay, and got me thinking about U.S. manufacturing. And so one of my last months there, it was manufacturing month at the White House, and someone from the NEC, or actually a special assistant to the president for manufacturing policy, wanted to make a slide deck for a cabinet meeting on kind of what caused the collapse in U.S. manufacturing employment, and what can be done about it. And so I actually got to make that slide deck for a cabinet meeting. I never heard of what happened.
That's amazing.
But it got me to think about it. And so at first I had this kind of traditional bias that most economists think that the decline in U.S. manufacturing employment is actually a good thing, that it's just a story about technological progress and maybe sectoral shift from manufacturing to services. And so I looked into this and just saw from the data that wasn't the case, that import competition and exchange rate movements are really what was behind it. And so I started to do research on this topic. And so around the same time, unfortunately, Otto Dorn Hansen and Pearson Schott came out with other papers showing that the rise of China and China's accession to the WTO were kind of primary factors among the decline in manufacturing employment. I got to comment. We had Justin Pierce out to the White House at some point, and he presented their research, and I saw right away that their research was very good. And both of those papers, I think, really pushed the envelope in empirical international trade, in the sense that they had kind of somewhat intuitive and identification strategies, which can't be said about all the work in empirical international trade, especially up to that point. But I saw that both of them had kind of missed the real exchange rate channel. And so the US dollar had appreciated a lot, essentially, after the Asian financial crisis. The Asian financial crisis, and then basically after that, a lot of these Asian countries, they didn't want to have to go cap in hand to the White House, so they started accumulating a lot of foreign reserves, and this put upward pressure on the dollar. After 9/11, you also have some fiscal stimulus. This also caused the dollar to appreciate, and all this stuff would have also not been good for U.S. manufacturing. So I ended up writing my dissertation on this, and so that all came from the work I did at the White House.
That's fascinating. That's now published work, right? Am I not wrong?
Some of it is published. There's like three different papers in this. There's like a series of papers I wrote about this. Two of the papers are published. One of them has a revise and resubmit at the European Economic Review. So actually, my job market paper that's now out for review for the 18th time.
For the
And so
18th
that
time.
Yeah, that's the 18th time.
Oh
So
my.
first I sent it to the QJE, and I got I think one good referee report, and the other one was not so good. And I sent it to the AER, and I had two referee reports. One was actually quite positive. The second one was negative. The second one also contained a lot of factual errors, and so I actually um, Peter Schott, who's kind of a senior in my field, was visiting Moscow at the time when I got the rejection, and he was like, "Well, you should dispute this rejection because you can just show that most of the things in the second referee report are actually factually incorrect." So I did. Unfortunately, the editor said that actually the topic, the collapse in U.S. manufacturing employment, is not an important enough topic to appear in the AER. So, in any case,
It looks pretty
but
important to us
this is how
now.
it goes. I think everyone who's in the profession has worse stories than that. So I've been actually quite lucky. So
I mean, it looks
thank
pretty
you.
important now. Just looking at the news, a lot of people are commenting that the
Yeah.
shift in manufacturing towards China has actually poorly equipped the United States to deal with the coronavirus epidemic and actually pandemic now. So I'm curious about your thoughts on this. First of all, I know you're in Moscow. I know you're based there as a professor at the new economics school. How do you see Russia handling this crisis? You know, they say, for example, if you just look at raw statistics, Russia has
Yep.
fewer cases than Canada and the United States put together. But on the other hand, they say that there's not enough testing being done. There are conspiracy theories about the government hiding tests, which, you know, to be fair, are conspiracy theories. But is there a kernel of truth in it in the sense that Russia did act early to close its land borders and to do various other things that might have prevented the spread of the virus? How would you say the Russians are handling COVID-19?
You're gonna get me deported here. Uh, no, so I don't want to. I don't know if I need to judge necessarily how they've done. So there's been some things that they've done quite well, and I've been
Yeah.
very impressed by. There's been other things that probably could have gone better, and so I suppose you could say that about any country as well. So the good things, some of the things that have impressed me. So they did block the border with China fairly early. On the other hand, I think something like 500,000 passengers still flew from China to Sheremetyevo after they blocked the border. And suspiciously few of those people who flew from China to Russia, and this is like since the end of January, were tested positive for COVID, right? And so
Hmm.
you want to ask, is that just dumb luck that somehow the Chinese and the other people who were flying from China to Russia just didn't have it, or is there something going on? Um, what else? But so something else that they did. So they blocked the border very early. Um, they also, at least they were screening passengers coming from China, and so they were probably doing things like testing their temperature. Anyone who reported or had a high temperature, they would have probably put in some kind of quarantine. The quarantine in Russia is kind of with teeth, and so they basically lock you in a room. On the bad side, sometimes they would, you might have very few symptoms, and you get locked in to the same room in a tight quarters with someone who actually has more serious symptoms. So that's not so good. Another thing is that actually in one of my school buildings, several weeks ago, from maybe like 3 weeks ago, they began putting one of these machines that scans people's temperature in the entryway. So I think this is a very good step, kind of for surveillance purposes. They also, I mean, according to the official data, they did do a lot of testing. There has been questions whether how accurate the tests are in Russia. And so I think, I mean, you could say it's kind of a conspiracy theory, but of course the US also had problems with its test when it was first rolled
Very
out.
much.
And even China, manufacturing powerhouse, initially they could not manufacture enough tests to test everyone. And so I think it's something that a lot of countries have actually had some kind of trouble with their tests. And I'd probably say that every country in the world should do more testing than they are. So the chat is that the recent increase in Russian numbers is because they've actually changed the test. So I heard anecdotally some oligarch bought a bunch of tests from China, imported them to Moscow, and they started testing people. And so this has actually caused the rise in numbers in Russia. In addition to that, I think it could be said that Russia was a little bit slow. They were quick to kind of shut the border with China, but they were rather slow to shut the border with Western Europe after the outbreak with Italy started. So I actually had 3 colleagues, including a visitor at NES, who were in Italy after the outbreak started there. One who was in northern Italy even, and then returned to Russia and were not placed in any kind of quarantine. So the other thing that Russia did was very cool. Well, depending on what your priors are, is that they have cameras all over Moscow, basically to track protesters, and they were using these cameras to look at Chinese students in Moscow who had violated their home quarantine. And so there's a story that a guy came back from somewhere. He was asked to self-quarantine. One day he went out to take out the trash, and the police turned up at his house. That's pretty good. But as I said, though, it's mathematically impossible that with all these Russians traveling in Western Europe, that there's really so few cases, as they say in Russia. So I don't know. Maybe it's that Russian people can't get virus, or
it seems like a problem
that something going on with tests, or something else. I don't know. I also talked to a doctor, and he said that no one really knows the real story. So.
And it seems like that's the case, to be honest, in my own country, in Canada. It seems like that's the case in the United States. You say that in Russia, the quarantine had teeth. In Canada, at least up until February and even early March, they were just asking people to self-identify as having symptoms at the border. So I'd like to actually turn to the United States now. And I mean, that's your specialty. You have some expertise, particularly in the United States, both from a policy and from an academic point of view. The U.S. now has more coronavirus cases than China, at least officially, right? If we believe China's official numbers, which I don't really think anybody does. But regardless, the United States has tons of coronavirus cases. And as far as I can see it, and based on what I've seen in your Twitter feed, I think you'll agree the White House was pretty late in taking this as seriously as other countries. What would you say, and if you were to lay out the administration's missteps in a sort of rough timeline, how would you lay those out?
So it's hard to say actually. So I guess I don't necessarily know that much about what was going on at the very beginning. So there's reports that the CIA was basically telling Trump, what an issue this would be, as some senators were dumping their stocks, and Trump was still saying that this is not going to be a big deal. When the first thing that really got my attention was this case at UC Davis, where someone was in critical condition, they were intubated, and they were not being tested. And so, I mean, the White House for sure would have been informed that there was someone in kind of critical condition, where the doctors recommended a test, and the CDC overruled and said for days not to test this person. This person who was in contact with a number of health people in UC Davis. And so it was clear that the White House would have known, first of all, that there was a patient kind of in critical condition, and secondly, that it was the CDC who was overruling them and telling them not to get a test. And so even after that, it took the White House a few days for them to kind of change their tune. I also think someone actually did report that some information that also kind of points to the conclusion that kind of the don't test, don't tell policy of the White House was actually an intentional policy rather than just kind of the result of incompetence. And so I would suspect that it will eventually come out that this was actually kind of a policy done on purpose. So there's the comment from Trump where he didn't want to take people off of the boat because he likes the numbers where they were, and so he was thinking that it's going to be bad for him politically if the case numbers go up. And so, the ways you can prevent the case numbers from going up is you can not test people. And so that's kind of like the original sin right there of the administration's policy. Around the same time, I also noticed that actually it was possible to book flights from New York City to Milan. There was
the same thing, yeah.
There was no restrictions on Americans traveling to Italy at this time. So I think you can point to 100 things, the ways that the cruise ships situations were handled, just very bad. The way that the travel restrictions were handled, why not test people when they're coming into the U.S., travelers from abroad, or do more strict screening, just wasn't done. In the initial stages of this, I think it's clear as well, as we move to quarantines and social distancing policies, that now we should be ramping up production of PPE. We should be ramping up production of, masks, ramping up production of respirators. And the administration, they have increased the number of tests quite a lot. But, I think it's clear that we should be doing this on a whole other level than what's been done.
So I want to follow up on that actually a little bit, because I was talking with another guy, Vincent Galesso from Western yesterday, and he and I disagreed on this. And I saw your tweet this morning about this. It was basically that this is a false dilemma to say that there's a trade-off between slowing down the economy and slowing down the spread of the virus, preventing it from proliferating.
Exactly.
And what you speak about with the PPEs, the fact that we have all of this need for PPEs, we have this need for test kits, we have this need for antibiotics, you name it, and we have an idle workforce. There seems to be like 2 and 2 equals 4.
There's zero with kind of the best case. The first best policies, there's like 4 categories of policies you can have here. There's like the policies that help the economy and make the virus better. And those we should just throw all kinds of money at. Ridiculous, even any type of cost-benefit analysis you do with that. This virus has wiped off trillions of dollars of shareholder value. U.S. GDP per day is something like 56 billion. Every day that the economy is shut down for this, the costs are just enormous. And so anything that can make the virus better, make the virus go away, and cost money, it almost doesn't even matter what the cost is. But then there's policies like the quarantine and social distancing policies, which really do have a very harsh cost. And so we have to be careful with those, and there is a trade-off with those policies. And then there's a third group of policies, which is going to help the economy, but maybe not help the virus so much, or even might be detrimental. And so things like subsidies to the airline and cruise industry probably, to do, but they might not be the most helpful. Other policies, stimulus money, I think should be done. Of course, people need to not be worried, and they should be allowed to stay at home. So those policies should be done. But also you put more money in people's pockets. They have more, they might go out and spend it. And then there's policies like don't ask, don't tell, which probably are bad all the way around.
Yeah, don't test, don't tell anybody. In that sense, just following up on that, the United States is a federation in a way, in the sense that the United States Constitution delineates certain responsibilities for the federal government and certain responsibilities for the state government. And throughout this crisis, I've noticed a underlying conflict between states, especially states like New York State, and the federal government, the White House. To what extent does this decentralization of power in the United States help or hinder the spread of the coronavirus?
So it's a good question. I don't know if I have a very good answer to that. I think that given the White House that we have, I'm glad that there are other layers of people who can deal with the crisis potentially. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, you would imagine that probably a first best solution would be a White House that's just on top of things. And so, of course, there's a lot that can be done at the federal level that states and local governments can't do as well. You know, at the feds they can print money, local and state levels cannot. And so, you know, we need to see more being done from the federal level. But then also, kind of the state and local governments can push the feds to do some things. And I think, I mean, if we're looking critically at the U.S. government response, you can't just say that it's been the Trump administration. That I think there will be plenty of blame to go around for state and local governments. The amount of testing in California has not been enough. You can say that actually about the testing in New York initially, even though it's coming on strong recently. But the rate of positives in New York is very high, and so the question comes up, you know, Manhattan, you know, New York City, it's one of the richest cities in the world. They can't ramp up testing faster than what they're doing, and so I think a lot of questions remain to be answered there. So
yeah, I agree with you there. I agree with I'd like to turn to some of the tweets you had. You've kind of addressed some of this already, but there's a mismatch between resources and what they're needed for, essentially. You know, we have, as you say, mass unemployment now, and some figures say that there will be 30% unemployment. In my country, Canada, we had 500,000 people file for employment insurance or unemployment insurances. And these tweets say we're soon to have mass unemployment, but we don't have enough people doing coronavirus testing. Our factories are running idle, but we don't have enough respirators, masks, testing kits. Our hotels are empty, but we have nowhere to quarantine the sick / those who test positive. So the message here seems clear. What should the government do right now that it isn't doing to address this mismatch?
Yeah, I think we just basically, the message is we need to shift resources from you know, where they're not being used to where they should. I think it seems clear that, you know, one of the things we need is central quarantine. We don't have a place to quarantine them. But then another problem is our hotels are all empty. You know, it doesn't take a genius to say that, look, why not use these hotels as quarantines? Maybe we can give the hotels some revenue, you know, some of their lost revenue they can get back by quarantining people who are sick and doing central quarantine. I would be throwing a lot of money at the production of PPE, respirators. I think there's a huge payoff there. We're sending checks to people anyway for doing nothing. Why not have them actually go to work? I mean, I think there's also would do something good for the psyche. You know, when people are sitting home just kind of fearing the virus or doing whatever, it's not the best for emotional health. If you actually send them to work or to help wipe down children's playgrounds or to kind of involved in the battle, involved in the struggle more, I think actually it would be something good for the nation's psyche, and to kind of get this feeling that, you know, we're all in this together and we need to go and we fight the enemy, which is this horrendous virus. I think it'd be important for the nation's psyche to kind of take on that kind of
and Trump has kind of framed it in that way, right? He's sort of cast himself as a wartime president. So if you're a wartime president, why don't you invoke a draft, right? Or at least have people enlist.
Ask for self-sacrifice. Exactly. I think it totally makes sense. So I left out a couple things. So one thing I want to say about a downside of this federal system, particularly since you got Trump at the helm, is that the current system that the U.S. has in place, the current set of policies, is obviously not going to work. And so part of the reason is you've got maybe a strict quarantine in parts of the U.S., but then you have no quarantine or no even shelter-at-home policies in other parts of the U.S. There is an open border between them. And so even if New York and California manage to get the caseload down to zero, it's not going to stay there for long, because other parts of the U.S. with an open border are not doing this, following the same policy. And so I think this is very problematic. The other thing I want to say about Russia's policy, which they basically, there's more federal power, I guess, in Moscow, is that one thing that was crazy is that up until about last Thursday or so, or last week, my sense was that most Russians were not taking the coronavirus threat very seriously. Since then, it's changed completely. And basically, it's Putin gave a speech. I mean, maybe I might be getting some of this wrong, but my take is that basically Putin gave a speech and suddenly switch flipped, and now Russians are not leaving their houses. They are following directions on this. It's actually been very impressive. So you can kind of contrast that with the way that President Trump has been going back and forth and saying, well, it's all a hoax, or the cure is worse than the disease, and so I think this kind of mixed messages coming out of the White House. It's
The
just
message
kind
has
of like
been pretty inconsistent. I would agree with you there. It's been, yeah, very mixed, as you say. And even about simple things like face masks, right? Do they work? Do they not work? Should the entire public
right,
be wearing them, right? Like, what's the message that we're supposed to be getting here? And one of the
yeah,
messages I think that people are being sent now is just sort of a skin in the game message. Congress is committed to a $2 trillion stimulus package. There are a number of popular provisions in this, number of things that people like the direct check you mentioned before, extended unemployment coverage, deferred student loan charges. However, the travel and tourism sectors are essentially being given $50 billion in emergency relief. And that's part of a $500 billion bailout that's broader for big business. I've heard, I'm not sure if this is true, I've read that essentially Mnuchin is directly responsible, at least his offices, for many of the disbursements of that particular money. Um, Given a bailout like this, how do you limit this problem that's going to be inherent in any bailout, which is moral hazard?
yeah. So I think it's a little bit challenging. So Tyler Cohen was talking about this the other day, and so I kind of liked his take that basically one thing we don't know is that when the virus eventually goes away, how different is the economy going to look? Like there could well be less travel, there could well be less people going on cruises, and to the extent that there's less people going on cruises, then maybe we don't want to shovel a bunch of money into the cruise industry now to keep it alive in the same the same size, the same shape it is. Um, I tend to not think this is the well, I personally would probably give smaller bailouts to the airline and cruise industries. I also don't think this is the biggest thing in the world necessarily. Um, I think the important thing is that, if you're giving that kind of money to the cruise and airline industries, and we should be throwing an order of magnitude more money at the PPE industry and building respirators, an army of cleaners on the street, these kinds of things. And so, although it's a negative thing, I'm not convinced that the moral hazard from this is necessarily going to have a first order negative impact on the economy. I just think it's kind of second order
Fair
either way.
enough. That's okay.
I might be wrong. I might be wrong on this as well. So
I mean, that's fair. I do want to ask actually about the role of monetary policy as well, because I believe I read your blog a few days ago, and also this was a part of your Twitter feeds. It was essentially the idea that, when we're in a recession, what you need to do is the Fed needs to buy bonds and then give those bonds to the Treasury. So for people who do not understand what mechanism that entails, could you just break it down for us?
yeah. So this is essentially. So I had a blog post on this a while back, and essentially my thought is that, I mean, imagine you get in a recession that's not related to the coronavirus now. The U.S. economy, I mean, the Fed usually manages short-term interest rates, and that's how it controls the economy. But when interest rates get to zero, it's kind of in a bit of a bind because, if you go to negative interest rates, it doesn't make sense for people to give out a loan for a negative interest rate, because if I give you money today, you give me less money back tomorrow. It's a good deal for you. Why should I do this? And so it's been thought that you can't have actually negative interest rates. So the question comes up is then what can the Fed do when you're in a zero lower bound situation to kind of support the economy overall? And so one of the things that I think should happen is that so one thing the Fed does is QE. They buy long-term bonds. I think most of the research suggests that this is somewhat helpful. If you look at announcement effects using kind of high frequency identification. On the other hand, not everyone thinks this is very effective. And so one of the reasons that it might not be effective is that if the Fed does QE today and it looks to stimulate inflation today, tomorrow it might take this stimulus away. And so you can kind of see this after, in the last few years, as the economy kind of started to recover, the Fed was actually very quick to kind of limit QE, to end QE, reverse QE, and actually to raise interest rates, even before the economy had really started growing. And so one thing that the Fed could do to kind of foster the idea that growth will be stronger today and stronger tomorrow would be some kind of a permanent QE. And if the Fed actually printed money, bought bonds, and returned that money to the Treasury, it could stimulate the economy in a number of dimensions. One of them would be it would encourage the government to spend money. So, right?
Yeah.
I mean, who's ever heard of a politician who won't spend a surplus if they have it, right? So any politician will spend it. The second thing is, even if they don't spend that money today, eventually, sometime in the future, they will spend that money. So if you might imagine that your taxes will at least be less in the future. The third thing it does is it kind of, it's not clear that it would be less easy for the Fed to reverse, but it would show that the Fed's really meaning business in trying to stimulate growth. And so I think this would be something that would make investors think that there's a bigger probability for kind of a V-shaped recovery. And so it's also about what's going to happen in the future, that the Fed is really intending this to be kind of a future monetary increase in the money supply. And so this goes back to the Krugman's 99 paper that what the Fed has to do in a liquidity trap is credibly promise to be irresponsible. That it's not just going to temporarily increase the money supply, but it's going to do so for the future. And so if you're borrowing money to build an apartment building. And you'll take out a nominal loan and you'll get a stream of nominal interest payments. If inflation is higher in the future, this nominal stream of flows you're going to get in rent from this apartment building is going to be higher, and the more likely you would be willing to take out a loan and do this investment. So the trick really is we need to create inflation somehow. And so this idea of fiscal support is one way to do it. So now, of course, this is a little bit different of a situation. And the big difference is that now we have a supply shock too. It's not a garden variety recession. And so I expect inflation probably will eventually might go higher. In this situation, where you're in a zero lower bound, it might actually end up being a good thing in that if inflation does go higher, the Fed might be in the situation where they can control interest rates they can control the economy with interest rates. But I think I would just be worried that actually the future Fed, they might see high inflation and slow growth, and they might respond by making monetary policy a little bit too tight. But I should mention that the one big surprise that we've seen so far is that the Fed has been more aggressive in doing various things, more creative and more aggressive than I would have thought they would have been.
Yeah.
And so this is a very good sign for the future. Very good sign for the future. I mean, every day they come out and they're doing something. There's a problem here, and they're going to solve it. They're going to address it. Next day there's another problem. They're going to address that too. And so I think this does point to the probability that there's going to be a V-shaped recession. And the problem with this is that, as I said, I mean, if the Fed cuts interest, if they actually succeed in promoting economic growth right now, this is probably succeeding in encouraging people to undergo activities that are not helpful for containing the virus. And so this is really a recession that all the Fed can do is kind of contain the worst part of the damage now as we put the economy on ice. They can't fix the problem. And so I think people have been saying on Twitter that to fix the recession, the economic damage, you need to fix the situation with the virus first. And so I think I would agree with that. And so that's not something the Fed can do. The government needs to try to solve the virus situation by doing things like mass testing with this this little village in Italy that did this randomized or this kind of cool test where they tested everyone in the village. They then quarantined the people who tested positive, and they tested everyone again, and they found that actually fewer people had the virus. It was actually very successful. Why not do that for the U.S. as a whole?
On a mass scale.
Throw $200 billion at testing. I'm sure you could do that. Why not do it? Stock market has wiped out trillions of dollars investor value. It's clearly cost benefit is positive there.
Yeah, we need creative solutions now. And I agree with you. I feel like this crisis, COVID-19, is going to make us as economists rethink the way we write economics textbooks. And for example, we often talk about Ricardian comparative advantage and we extol it as if it's some kind of deity. But it relies on a number of assumptions that may be a little bit, I suppose, incredulous. For example, the idea of fixed prices, the idea that, in a shock, you're going to be okay, like what's happened now. A lot of the pharmaceuticals and masks and PPE that we need come from China, and China is not able to deliver those equipment to us now. So do you believe that this is going to, or should we rather, even if it doesn't happen, should we as economists rewrite and rethink our way of presenting economics to first-year students and to even undergraduate students more broadly?
That's a great question. So I've always wondered. So I do believe in free trade, but I've often wondered whether it would be a good idea if you have a country which you might one day see as an aggressor, as an enemy, whether some kind of free trade arrangement with them. I think it's still debatable whether free trade with these kinds of countries is beneficial or not, and under what kind of circumstances. And then you add to the fact that actually the situation with China it's not been one where we actually have had free trade. So they've undervalued their currency for a long time. They've provided subsidies to many different manufacturing industries. They've required technology transfers from European and US companies in order to gain access to the Chinese market. Many US firms like Facebook are completely cut off from China. Chinese firms stole Google's source code. This German train manufacturer also just got its intellectual property ripped off. I mean, you could go on and on about the deviations from free trade that the U.S. has dealt with China. So I've long been a bit of a hawk on China. That said, I'm not a fan of the administration's policies towards China. I think the way to do this would be and focus on transparency and do this on a multilateral basis rather than having the U.S. be seen as the aggressor in a trade war with China. So you don't want to teach all the young Chinese people growing up that the U.S. is their enemy, right? It's got to be the entire world is promoting kind of the policies that we want to see with China. And, I think this could be one of the. So I think this situation could play out in a number of ways. But I think when you're looking at this, I think it's a reasonable conclusion to think that maybe it's a good idea It's not a good idea if all of U.S. manufacturing and the supply chain is completely dependent on one foreign country in particular, and particularly if that's a country that might not completely share our value system, or So I think it's a very fair question to ask whether this is a good situation or not, and I don't think it necessarily makes the case for unilateral free trade, so that the U.S. to have free trade and China to adopt their own policies to capture key industries located there. But I think that the way to deal with this, I think that there could be. I think the best solution would be one in which the U.S. and China have kind of a bilateral free trade, right? But that's not the situation we had before, and it's not clear that it's going to be a reality of a situation that we'll be in the future. So I mean, there's also this um, literature in political science that no two nations that have ever fought a war that have both had a McDonald's or something. So I don't know if that's true anymore, but there's something to this. If
Yeah.
China has $3 trillion in U.S. treasuries, if if you owe the bank $1 million, they say the bank owns you. If you owe the bank $1 billion, you owe the bank, kind of thing.
So would
Um,
it be fair to say that you would say that we shouldn't necessarily rewrite the textbooks and rewrite the theories, but rather that we should add more nuance?
yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah. That's a
Because
good way of
because
nice way of putting it.
I agree with you. I don't think it's been a free trade situation. I do think one thing that this administration has highlighted is the fact that, yeah, we do claim that this is free trade, but it really isn't. The IP theft and all of these subsidies, you're right, the deflation of the currency really don't correspond to free trade. I'd like to follow up on that and ask about China specifically. There seem to be reports now coming out of China that the CCP is suppressing, which suggests that China's case numbers are not dwindling to the extent that China claims they are. They might be dwindling more broadly, but there are still many cases. On your Twitter, a 3M employee confirmed to you that China is continuing to order respirators. Why would they if they have the virus contained? And have you seen any other evidence that contradicts the CCP's original official story?
So I've read a few things. There's just so much, like the enormity of news around coronavirus is just so overpowering that I wouldn't say
Yeah.
that I'm an expert on the data in China. I was very skeptical. It's just I think she realized a few things. And so the first was that China was going to get blamed for coronavirus around the world. It probably still is to an alarming degree. And so I'm doing a project now looking at kind of discrimination against Chinese people on Airbnb and Tinder,
Cool.
or maybe I guess preference shocks. And so what it shows is that
That's
yes,
really cool, actually.
people are
Yeah.
yeah, the people are not. I think there's a lot of evidence that people from China, even people who look Asian, are facing some kind of discrimination
Mhm.
because of this. And so I think he's probably very astute politically to kind of pull a 180. And so the other thing I think he realized is that this mostly kills older workers. Older workers, as much of a shame as it might be in the mind of Xi, are not necessary to work in promote China's manufacturing powerhouse. They're not key clogs in the machine, and they can kind of be sacrificed. And
Mhm.
so I thought it was just a little bit eye-opening how quick it was from China's pivot from, okay, we have tons of cases, tons of new cases every day, we're battling, and then suddenly it was, okay, we've solved it. Let's open the factories, everyone back to work, and you must go back to work. Um, and so it's just a little too abrupt for my liking, and so I was just very skeptical. Since then, of course, it's also come out that um, some doctors in Wuhan are saying they had a bunch of new cases, off the record. People have reported this. If you look at places like Shanghai and Beijing, it just seems like this has left a very large imprint on the Chinese psyche and on the Chinese economy that it just beggars belief that there's only 500 cases in Beijing,
Yeah.
6 weeks ago, and now traffic is still down 40% a couple months later. Also, I mean, China's a country of 1.4 billion people. When they decided to shut down the economy, there was like 1,000 deaths officially. She's going to shut down
Yeah.
the Chinese economy for 1,000 deaths. I mean, that's a rounding error on the number of flu deaths in China. It's like, how did they even notice 1,000 people died?
I'm sure it's orders of magnitude more.
I think it's for sure one order of magnitude more, and I think it's realistic that it's several orders
Yes.
of magnitude. But as I have no real data to back that up, and neither does anyone else. And so I guess the answer
Uh,
is we don't know.
it's all
I
speculation.
But in a world where China is importing manufactured goods from Russia, is a world in which China had vastly more than 3,000 deaths and 15,000 people hospitalized. Is my
Yeah,
cut.
I would agree. Let's turn to something a bit lighter than
Yeah.
coronavirus. I'm going to ask you, first of all, you were in Moscow, and Moscow actually is one of those cities I'd love to visit, along with Colombo
Yeah, you should come. You should
and
come.
yeah, Colombo and Budapest. It's one of my top three cities. How do you like living in Moscow? Have you learned Russian, and how is life in Moscow?
Yeah, so I do. I speak Russian with a thick American accent, but I can communicate. People usually understand me. I can pretty much understand them. I think Moscow is one of the most underrated cities in the world. I think it's gotten maybe a lot of bad press because of politics, because of Putin. I think it's a very dynamic city. There's a lot to do, a lot of parks. Public transportation is very good there, and I've actually enjoyed living in Moscow a lot, maybe more than I expected. But yeah, so I've enjoyed it a lot. I've also thought that the people have had to come visit, other economists who've come to see the city. I hosted a conference during the World Cup where a bunch of economists came. I think the consensus is that Moscow is a quite nice city, and also it beats expectations substantially. So at the present time, I have no plans to leave. So
That's fantastic. So
hopefully they won't
everybody,
kick me out after this interview.
yeah, fantastic. So everybody should go to Moscow. Everybody should
I
try
think
out Moscow.
I think so. I agree with that a
For
lot. So
Canadian, for my
yeah,
Canadian viewers, that means a visa, but it's worth it,
yeah.
right?
Yes, it is. So actually, Moscow's supposedly moving to. I mean, once this coronavirus thing ends, it's going to be moving to an e-visa.
Oh,
And so I'm not sure if it includes Canada, it includes Europeans, but I think it should be much soon. Could be much easier to come. So the only caveat there is now with the coronavirus, you're just not allowed in at all.
oh.
But maybe in a year or two, the situation will change. So.
Fantastic. So, second question. I mean, I have a lot of student viewers, a lot of
Mhm.
people in their undergrads, and I've even had students come up to me and ask me, I want to do economics. How should I go about this? And this is actually, I find, a pretty hard question that students ask you because your experience may not translate perfectly to theirs, right? But that being the case, you have policy experience, you have experience in academia. So I could say that you have your feet wet in the real world as opposed to just being a Platonist. Uh, what heuristic advice, even if it's not specific advice, what heuristic advice would you suggest to a young person who's interested in a career in economics, interested in grad school in economics, before they even, make that commitment?
Yeah. So one thing I would say is that I think you should go and do a bunch of things before you make this decision. Go and work as an intern in an investment bank. Maybe go to DC and work,
Ottawa.
or Ottawa. Right. Good. Good. Thanks for
Yeah.
helping me out there. I'm sorry.
Fair enough.
uh, yeah, exactly. Go try to work in government. Maybe see if you like it. Maybe work as a research assistant. So this is the one thing where the typical undergrad experience is that they're very excited to be a research assistant, and they actually see what research is composed of, and then 2 weeks later, they want nothing to do with research anymore. I would recommend you go and you do all of this. You build up your CV and you see different parts of the world, the way different people think, and then you try to think about where you want to make your stamp and what you want to do with the rest of your life. So, I mean, there's the old joke, what are the three best reasons to become a college professor? The answer is June, July, and August. And so I think that's very true, but I think there's actually not a clear, and there's huge trade-offs between a career, say, in consulting or finance, public service, or coming to academia. And so I think it's probably not the case that one is obviously the better, it's better than the other. There are some things that are very frustrating about academia. So the publication process can be frustrating.
Mm.
It's not all things aren't all great. There are some things which are amazing, and just the amount of free time and the amount of freedom you have as a professor is pretty good. And so I think it's almost certainly the case, even if one profession, you can't say definitively that one profession is better than another. Being a tenured economics professor is probably up there with being one of the better
Yeah.
jobs. On the other hand, grad school is a long time. You're giving up a lot of salary while you're a grad student. It's hard work, and also getting tenure itself can be a grind. It can be very
Yeah.
difficult. And I'm not sure that I will, in fact. So there's that.
Yeah, fair enough. So where can we find you? What's your Twitter? What's your webpage? And by the way, I'll put a link to all of these things in the description.
Awesome. Yeah, my
Yeah.
Twitter is at Trade and Money, and I also have I have a blog as well. I need to actually, I think Douglas L. Campbell .blogspot.com. I blog infrequently, but a couple times a year, and I usually
Yeah.
post links to that on my Twitter. Um, I think, yeah. So other than that, I guess you can Google my name, Douglas Campbell, and NES, New Economic School, and find my homepage.
Fantastic. Yeah, there are lots of Douglas Campbells when I when I was doing research for this interview. So
Yeah, it's hard to find names.
NES.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much. This has been a very fantastic, very interesting interview, and I appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on. It was a
Thank-
pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank
Doug.
you.
Have a good one.
Yep. All right.